The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, coming to you deep, we'll call it deep, from The Shadow Rising, Book 4 in the Wheel of Time saga. And joining you today to talk about Chapter 5, Questioners, and Chapter 6, Doorways, which could both be folk songs. I, of course, am Greg, the host who knows nothing about these books, and I am joined by the illustrious Tylor, who knows a lot more and keeps telling me things I need to not read because I will get things spoiled. Tylor, how's it going?
It's going very well. There are a lot of things that you should not read in order to avoid being spoiled, unfortunately. And it's also really great to feel like it's not wrong for you to say we are getting deep into book 4 of the Wheel of Time. Like, I feel like we have made some significant progress, even though somehow this is the first time that we are getting to check in with Egwene and Nynaeve and Elayne. You had commented on that last week, how it felt really nice that everyone was in the same place, except those characters hadn't really shown up. How do you now feel about kind of the same place, parallel stories structure that we seem to be constructing between the boys and the girls so far?
I mean, I was glad that we didn't go any longer without them. And you're right. I think my hesitation in saying, we're getting deep into it is the fact that it is such a long book. But there's something mentally when I'm reading that, like the 100-page markers, I'm like, I read a chunk of a book now. And so it's only about 10%. I was just double checking while you were talking if listeners heard my pages rifling. So my paperback, mass market paperback, is 993 pages. So it's that's not counting the glossary or the preview of the next book. So a solid 10% that we now have under our belt. But I'm enjoying it a lot so far. It is, again, still kind of balancing. Here are some reminders of things you need to know. I don't know. I mean, spoiler, Nynaeve has to get mad to channel, which I think they drop in like 7 times in the chapter. It's like, yeah, I get it. Yeah. My memory is bad and these are helpful, but I don't need this many of them, which really means it was dropped in 15 times and I only caught 7 of them. But yeah,
it reminds me every time of that joke from The Good Place where they're like, we got all 4 clues that you left us. And he's like, oh, I actually left you 12,000 clues because of how simple your brains are. That's kind of how I feel reading Robert Jordan sometimes. I've probably read this particular book at least a dozen times, and I think I caught something new today. So It's dense, y'all. That being said, I'm going to try to undense it as much as possible by giving us a kind of quick review of Chapter 5, which I find to be a chapter that, as you say, tells us a lot of things we kind of already knew. Did you have any last thoughts before we dive into that recap?
Just that I want to tell you to go right ahead and let's do it. So Chapter 5, Questioners.
So Egwene is wondering where Moiraine has run off to. We learned that she promised the girls that she would give them an hour to try to help interrogate the 2 Black Aja sisters who had been captured at the end of the previous book. We also learn that not only is Moiraine kind of left abruptly, but that it was one of the Aiel who came and got her. And pretty quickly, we're able to piece together that this is the same night that we had been reading about in the previous chapters. We get a little bit of an introduction or reintroduction to Avienda, who is also with them and seems kind of very formal and almost apologetic anytime that she disagrees in any way with Egwene or any of the other girls. We also learn that all three of the girls are more or less maintaining the lie without directly lying that they are Aes Sedai. No one is contradicting that idea, and so they are letting themselves kind of appear to be full Aes Sedai rather than accepted. In addition, we get a few observations about both of the other girls other than Egwene. We learn that Nynaeve has been almost exclusively wearing Lan's favorite colors, for example. And we get a number of kind of descriptions of what Rand has done and how he's shaken things up since he arrived in Tyr. For example, he got rid of all of the torture implements in the basement of the Stone of Tyr. Joya Beer, one of the two Black Aja sisters, is in the room, currently being held in bonds of air and shielded from the source, and also has something blocking both her eyes and ears so she can't see and hear. Amiko is also there, but she doesn't need to be shielded because she was stilled at the end of the previous book. She talks about how her desire to channel will never go away, and Egwene thinks of that as basically a fate worse than death. And then we also learn what we have kind of gotten the information from both of the Black Aja sisters. One of them says, I believe this was Amiko was the first to speak, said that she overheard a conversation between Leandrin and someone else saying that they were going to go to Tanchico, and there was an object that would be as dangerous to him, probably referring to the Dragon Reborn, as anything else could be. We then switch who is able to see and hear. Amiko is bound again and has things covering her eyes and ears, and Joya begins talking. She is told to say the same story again, but in different words, and begins to tell a story about how the Black Aja are going to find and free Mazarim Taim, the false dragon who had previously been rampaging in Saldia, and their plan is to set him free, have him declare himself the Dragon Reborn, and have him impersonate Rand, and that way when he commits a number of atrocities, the world will rally together against Rand. The girls kind of briefly are talking about whether which of these seems more likely or how they're going to decide between the two possible things, and they don't know who is lying. And then at this moment, Moiraine bursts through the door and says that Rand is extremely something. She's furious, and that's the end of the chapter. I found this to be, of the two, the wrap-up chapter more than the push the plot forward chapter. That being said, there were a few kind of fun moments in here. What was your kind of takeaway from the first of these two? Because I think overall the pair works, but this is the one of the two that if it was on its own, I might raise my eyebrow about whether this was a completely necessary chapter.
Yeah, so the bulk of my notes is just kind of mapping out the fact that we have two prisoners, which we were not aware of, to my knowledge.
Both of them were, I think, either unconscious or captured at the end of the previous book, but we hadn't been aware that they were still here, that they had been questioned, anything beyond the fact that Egwene stilled one and Matt knocked another one out.
I guess, you know, if this were Law and Order, there would have been the scene at the last one of them getting ducked into the cop car so that we knew they had two Black Aja, and I don't think we'd gotten that obvious a hint. So I made sure to write down the names because I knew I'd forget them. And then again, it's kind of this simple thing of they each have an option, a story, a version of what the plan is, and then they have to decide which one they're going to follow as a part of that. And so it seems clear that they are leaning towards the plan of now I've already screwed it up. Tanchico, the prize.
Amiko Tanchico. It actually works.
Amiko Tanchico. And leaning towards that one being true and being the one they should follow. Amiko is also Amiko is the other one, but
Amiko is the one who was stilled and the one who claims that she has repented and is now on the light side.
That's what I was going to ask. Yes. So the repenter is the stilled, which I was thinking it's very easy to say like, oh, I'm going to be on your side now that I have no power or what have you. And so the only other kind of interesting thing I was like, well, so we're just taking on the surface that Black Aja can lie. Like they are not held to the three rules or anything like that. It was one of those things where they made reference to the fact that they cannot lie, how they, Moiraine had carefully not said they were Aes Sedai, but not said they weren't Aes Sedai,
Yeah.
so that they could not break the rules, but also, be intimidating in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think that was really kind of a subtle hint, but then it was like, oh, so it's just they could both be lying. One could be lying. There's no rules here as a part of that. So that was a whole bunch of word salad, but those are where my thoughts were.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important, right? And I think this is something that Robert Jordan has done before at points, is he has kind of given us kind of the base information and then let one of the girls make the logical leap of what does that mean. And I think in those instances, in some books, we would kind of have the immediate response of like, ooh, I doubt that, because when a character jumps to something like that, I assume that they're, making some sort of dramatic irony setup for later on in the book, right? But for whatever reason, I think when Robert Jordan does that with these characters piecing together information, he often does it in the place of exposition, right? For example, I forget if it's at the end of this chapter or the beginning of the next one, but there's a moment where Elayne pieces together like 3 or 4 pieces of information and like synthesizes them. And for whatever reason, I never feel like I doubt that when Robert Jordan gives that to Egwene or Elayne. And that's kind of how I felt about the conclusion that the Black Aja can lie, right? The way that it was presented in the book is more or less Egwene saying like, well, obviously they have to be able to lie. And like, I don't even know if she goes quite this explicit, but it's basically like if someone asked them what their Aja was, they'd have to be able to say something other than black. And so, like, I think logically it makes sense, but it's one of those places where I think as a first time reader, you could very easily like start thinking like, is it like, are we being led off course here? Like, there's a couple places later on that I'm going to be like, I think that might not be true, even though someone said it. But here, I just sort of feel like it is. Was that kind of where you were at, as you were kind of like, I'm not sure, but I kind of trust it because it's Egwene? Yeah, I guess I'm curious what the first time reader's perspective was.
I would say that's where I was. And I think I've confessed on air before, like, this is just a part of the mythology I forget about. I forget about the not lying. Like, I really think I am losing something by every time Moiraine talks, not thinking really carefully. And that's my fault, not the book's fault. It's just like with spinning so many plates, I'm like, I don't remember that one rule. So many of our great complex board games, you'll play for like 3 sessions and then be like, oh, we forgot this one rule on page 7. And like my gaming group was really good at Pandemic Legacy. And then we remembered something we should have been doing all the time and so on.
Been there.
So it feels like that. It's like, oh, I forget. I think the book follows the rules. I just forget to be watching and gaining insight into that.
I think 99% of the time you'd be right. This is actually one that I think is a pseudo retcon. Like, I don't think the Oath Rod gets mentioned until midway through book 3. So you haven't missed that many references to it. I've just been like hitting them real hard because the Varen mystery is so important to my understanding of this series. And she lied. She did a book and a half ago.
Other than that, like, I think in this chapter, you were right to say at the beginning of your discussion that you really focused on the 2 new names. And I found Amiko, we've already kind of talked about. The girls seem to trust her a little bit more. She's kind of seems like she's repented the light. But Joya just seems like a horrific monster that the girls don't trust because the story is just too scary. And there's a part of me that thinks that is the much more interesting character of those 2, if only because it's different from most of what else we've seen in the Wheel of Time, which is usually pretty shades of gray other than the Forsaken.
Well, and in the atmosphere of that scariness is how she's bound and the ways in which we're seeing the power be used this chapter. Now, I was not shocked by this because we've essentially seen this on the show in a different context, but this kind of power set. And so I was like, oh, well, I've seen this. I can picture this in my head. But it does seem like the power is, usually the power just is like a nudge or a little push in these books. And this is like the power being used for extreme control. It is not the same as the collar and all that, but it is binding, right?
Yeah.
I think of Jill Lepore wrote a really good book on the history of Wonder Woman, and basically was eventually like, look, the dude just liked like
Yeah.
binding up women. Like you can't get around it. Like there's no way to like stop thinking about
Yeah.
that because she always finds her way into chains. But I do
Or
think there's
lassos. Don't.
oh yes, yeah. Well, he invented the lie detector too, so those
Yeah.
were his two things. So yes, so I do think there's a way here where it's like, oh well, this is kind of monstrous that this is
Yeah.
the way the power is being used, and it feels well, now I'm going to just jump to a different DC character. It feels like in the Dark Knight movie when it's like, this is a power nobody should have, but we have to use it to fight the darkest force, right? You have to burn down the forest, I think is the metaphor Michael Caine uses. That's not his character's name. But yeah, and I think there's a feeling here as well. There's this desperation that, yes, the Dark One and the Forsaken are these major threats, but the one the girls are responsible for and have been charged with solving is the Black Aja, and they're gonna burn down the forest to capture them. And in some cases that feels like they're gonna be monstrous and really demanding. And they make it clear Nynaeve is not currently very angry, but it is her who says with different words, or is that Egwene who says with different words?
I think it's Nynaeve.
Yeah. And that's like a little bit of like cat has a mouse, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm making you do the same thing again. You have to do it differently or else I'm going to torture you, it felt like.
Yeah, and I think you're highlighting really effectively kind of the change in tone that we are seeing with the girls, right? It feels like they are kind of much more adult and serious in the way that they're going about things. But I also want to kind of bring back, you had mentioned at the beginning, kind of the step up in power. I think that's deliberate by Robert Jordan, right? I think the fact that these girls have probably been able to interact with Moiraine while able to channel for the first time in their lives. They are accepted. They're definitely a step up from where they were in the previous book. And they are just developing their abilities in a way that hasn't happened before, right? In the previous book, like Nynaeve and Elayne discover 5 different things they can do without even trying to do it. And so I feel like it's worth noting this isn't just them stepping up, as you're saying, in terms of their like intensity or their willingness to do dark things. It's also just them doing things that they probably physically couldn't have done with the power in the previous book. And so that I don't want to use the like video game like terminology of power creep, but it definitely feels like we're in a slightly different realm in terms of what the girls are capable of here than where we were in the previous book. Although, as you know, we do learn the restriction on Nynaeve 87 times. She's not mad enough.
No, not at all mad, and that's a problem. You wouldn't like her when she's mad. Yeah, and I certainly, I mean, I know listeners know we are fanboys, but not hagiographic ones, in that we do point out flaws. But since we've been talking so negatively, I will say this is all interesting and compelling, right?
Oh,
to
absolutely.
jump us into these mysteries and kind of have us piecing this all together. While it did lead to some questions like power creep or these other things, it's like, oh, but it's good to be back with these characters and essentially get in a very succinct, straightforward manner, like, here's what they're working on this book. And it would surprise me, though perhaps not shock me, if they kind of wrapped up their story before the last 100 pages. But this seems to be the hint of what they're doing this time around.
Absolutely. I will say this was the chapter of the 2 that I immediately read it and thought this feels like a kind of fun to read, but not much to say sort of chapter. I think I have exhausted already the things that I have for this one. I have much better notes for the second. Was there anything else here that you kind of thought of, or any other characters you wanted to highlight, any of their interactions?
I really don't. So I will just share my shorthand for the 2 options is the somebody else will be named Rand planned is very concrete, but weird. And the other option, the go to Tanchico, is vague, but feels like a Terangriel, sorry, and feels like that's a good MacGuffin for a book. I mean, each book has kind of been about going somewhere or getting something. So it feels like, to me, it feels like, that's not just the one they like, but kind of where you're going this book. So yeah, that's how I shorthanded them.
Well, good job laying out the two options that our characters could potentially walk through, which we will then further discuss. And I think the poorly named next chapter, doorways. So Moiraine enters and begins cursing Rand's stubbornness in front of the girls, which I wrote down with an exclamation point. Elayne thinks of one of Linny's old sayings, as she does repeatedly throughout this chapter. She has a gimmick now, just like Suan. Nynaeve says that this is just how Two Rivers men are, but then she goes a step too far and lies, saying that Two Rivers women never have a hard time with the Two Rivers men. At this point, Elayne remembers that Joya is still not bound, and so she immediately kind of gestures to Moiraine, who seems shocked. She saw the guards outside and assumed that both of the prisoners were not in the room, and so she immediately kind of composes herself, and Elayne immediately recognizes the fact that if that had happened to any of the other girls, Joya immediately would have jumped on it and made some sort of comment and belittled them and made them doubt themselves. But Joya is more or less terrified of Moiraine. She refuses to respond in any way. She stares at the door. She doesn't react at all. At this point, Moiraine says that in 4 days, Joya will be taken to Tar Valon and she will face punishment for all of the horrible things that she has done. And at this point, Avienda is sent to get the guards to take the two Black Aja Aes Sedai out of the room, and Avienda uses this as an opportunity to run screaming from Moiraine, which I appreciate about a character. At this point, the guards come in, and it becomes immediately apparent that they are every bit as uncomfortable with Moiraine and the girls as they are with the Black Aja. They seem extremely uncomfortable, even with the idea of an Aes Sedai being in the stone. At this point, we start to get a number of conversations about what happened with Rand and what Moraine's interaction with it was. First off, we learn that Elayne was in Rand's chambers, or at least Elayne learns that Elayne was in Rand's chambers. And then we get kind of a simultaneous, I found slightly confusing conversation where at the same time, Egwene and Elayne are talking about their relationship with Rand, and Egwene basically reassures Elayne that she is not in love with Rand and that she can like pass it off. And at the same time, Nynaeve is confronting Moiraine about not helping with the questioning. And when Moiraine tries to dodge this line of questioning, she then starts admonishing the girls, saying that the customs of Mayenne are not those of their homes, and that Rand cannot be for either of them because he belongs to fate. At this point, Nynaeve starts asking Moiraine whether she has been in love, and Moiraine gives a surprising answer. She says that she knows the face of her husband better than any of the girls in the room likely do. Elayne asks who she is going to marry, and she only says that it won't be Lan. We then get my favorite description of what Nynaeve is going through from Elayne. She says it is, quote, a hard patch to hoe, and she's not wrong. Nynaeve then berates them all for talking about men, and I kind of agree with her. I wish we had passed the Bechdel test in one of these two chapters. And then they start deciding basically which of the two possibilities, either Amiko or Joya's, is more likely to be a lie or a trap. Moiraine tells them then what happened with Rand, and also says that Rand must learn to channel so he can defend himself from these bubbles of evil, but she can't teach him, and we learn that Saidin is just so different from Saidar that Moiraine thinks it is impossible for her to help him with channeling at all. Moiraine is still clearly sizing up the girls, kind of deciding if she trusts them, but eventually says that he must act. She says he is losing the initiative in Tyr, and that the Terrans are kind of stopping to believe in him. And then at this point, she says that she wants him to go to Ilion, topple Samael, and basically unite the entirety of the south of the continent. She then says that Rand is reading too much prophecy. She quotes some prophecy, which we will definitely read through and talk about. At this point,
oh boy,
yeah, more prophecy. At this point, Nynaeve basically justifies what Rand is doing by saying he's desperate, and so he's seeking answers in the prophecy. Moiraine then says that she knows that she is desperate as well, and so she plans to use an artifact that is held in what is called the Great Holding. She describes a twisted redstone door frame, and she says that if you step through it, you will be given 3 answers to questions about the past, present, or future, and those answers will be true. The girls are very excited about this, thinking they can ask about the 2 plans that they've basically been given by the Black Aja to determine which is correct, but Moiraine tells them that there are dire consequences for questions related to the shadow, and so that would be a terrible plan of action. She then more or less immediately leaves after giving them a bit of a history lesson about where the twisted redstone door frame came from. At this point, Egwene, Elayne, and Nynaeve start having a conversation. Egwene and Elayne basically patch up all of their discussion about Rand. Elayne decides that she is hopelessly in love with him and she needs to find a way to get him away from Barrelane. We also get a little bit of conversation where it becomes obvious that Nynaeve knew that this was the case all along. And then finally, we basically get a brief discussion where they say, what are we going to try to do? They're going to talk to Rand directly. And then they say, we need to do it now because Rand might die. And then Egwene says, well, actually, we all might die. And that's a cheery way to end a chapter. That was a really long description. What of it stood out to you? Because a lot happens there, even though I think it's just a conversation in a room between four people.
It is really fun to get Moiraine in the mix with this group again, because where we're talking about, it actually reminds me a lot of the end of the last book where we were talking about how Egwene rose significantly and now was on par with Nynaeve. This chapter seems to say there are a lot of ways in which you would have read these girls on the same level as Moiraine, and we should not do that. And Moiraine is very clearly asserting, you should not do that, girls. We are not at all equals. We should not do this. And I like that as an inter-character dynamic, right? You know, maybe it's the teacher in me. Like, you're forever getting a student who's like, oh, it's the Matt Damon, like, I read Vickas, and how do you like them apples? And so somebody will come with a challenging idea. And I want to be very clear, I don't think my students listen to this, but I do love this, right? Like when a student takes the initiative to learn something and then challenges with you, that's often like a great teaching moment because one, you might learn something, or two, you can then help them know how to enter discourse in this way. So, but all of that is to say, this feels like a very natural moment where these girls stepped away from this woman who was in some ways their first teacher or somebody who initiated them to this world. And now that they've all kind of been on a bit of a journey separately to reunite them and see how those dynamics challenge each other. It's just fun, and it's written well, so it bounces off each other. I did giggle at your Bechdel point. I had not caught that myself, but yeah, it's true that it does kind of just digress in the middle to like, and who do you have a crush on? And who do you have a crush on? And so that's a little unfortunate, but it still doesn't diminish the fact that these are four pretty cool women characters. And I guess my hesitation at 4, I would say Elayne often doesn't get included in that, but this chapter made me appreciate Elayne a lot more. So I'll put her I'll say 4 at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to your point about it being kind of nice to recheck in on these characters, I thought that it was really interesting. Literally the first sentence of this chapter made me like almost my floor or my jaw dropped to the floor. I was like, wait a minute, Moiraine is being emotional in front of a human being that isn't Lan? What is going on here? Like, I think it's really important to recognize that while it's really fun to see these characters in the same room again, this is not the Moiraine that I am used to seeing in the room with characters who are younger than her, right? She is such a commanding, domineering presence. The fact that she is letting the girls see her be frustrated, I feel like is a sign that even if they're not yet Aes Sedai, she is treating them more as equals than she had at any point prior in the series. And I think that comes out a couple of times where Elayne notes that Moiraine is kind of sizing them up. And then after she does, Moiraine tells them her plans. And that is not a thing that Moiraine has ever done.
And you know, we were just doing some joking the other day, and I texted game recognize game, right? That's the attitude here. It's like, and yet not at the same time, right? So, and I'm just going to keep on the teaching thing. That's what a good teacher does. Makes you feel like you're an equal, but then also is like, but I still have more I can show you here. And, you know, I just want to emphasize that in the middle of that mix is the fact that they are charged by the Amerlin seat. And so that's why they think, you know, and Moiraine outright says, like, I don't care what letter you have, right? Like that doesn't matter to me. So, I do think it is giving us a clear pecking order still, in case we were confused that the girls and their letter meant they were acting beyond Moiraine. Not so much.
I do really appreciate the tiny bit of dramatic irony that we have here, which is that the girls think like, yeah, we got the Merlin on our side when they're literally talking to the only woman in the world who is in a conspiracy with the Merlin to interact with Rand. Like, they got nothing on her relationship with Siwan, let me tell you.
And I'm just going to emphasize in that one, the relationship, I had trouble remembering that the relationship is what the books defined the Amberlin Moiraine relationship as, not what the TV show did. Because with that version of the relationship in mind, it was like, oh, you really don't know what you're up to. But yes, the dramatic irony still works.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I had early in this chapter, early in this early section of the chapter, we had already kind of highlighted just how different Moraine's reaction is to Joya than it is, to all of the other girls. But I also just wanted to take a moment to just say I loved that Avienda just pieced out. She was given an order to leave the room and not to come back, and she didn't.
I mean, it's the little kid when the sibling is getting in trouble, right? Like it's like, yeah, I'm gonna let you get in trouble and not be a part of this.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I also just want to like shine a little bit of a light on, we knew that the Terrans would be uncomfortable around Aes Sedai, right? We learned in the last book that channeling is more or less banned in the entire country of Tyr, but I don't think we had any indication that Aiel would have kind of any distrust or reason to be nervous around Aes Sedai. But even though Avienda seems relatively close to the girls, she's quite formal and seems apologetic when she disagrees with them. And then she clearly defers directly to Moiraine. So I think there might be something there just to keep an eye on. But then we get into the Rand talk. Right. We have a series of conversations, both about what happened to Rand and what Moiraine intends for Rand, and then also about Egwene and Elayne's feelings for Rand. I found the kind of overlapping conversation a little bit hard to follow because Elayne wasn't fully narrating what she was talking about in many cases. So you were kind of figuring it out as you went. Did you find that section as lightly confusing as I kind of did?
I mean, no, I'm an expert. What are you talking about? I'm way smarter than you are at that. I do think that it read like a spy movie, that you are kind of always doing that kind of double. Here's what the characters are saying, but here's what they're doing. What comes to mind is the greatest action film series of our lives, the Mission Impossible series. But the very first Mission Impossible has a whole
the good one.
Yeah, the Brian De Palma one. I thought you liked the John Woo one best. That's just
that one's also fun, but
but he has a whole montage where a character is explaining how she's innocent while the images on screen are Ethan piecing together that she is not innocent, and how and that kind of gap was something really hard to figure out the first time I watched that movie 25 years ago. I think it's pretty old at this point. But it does feel like that kind of doubling thing going on here, right? Like we have to be thinking about what she's saying, how it has to be literally true, but how there's that gap, like we were talking about, and so on. So, yeah, well, and I just don't want to lose from your summary. I loved the joke about how the lie about how women have learned to control the men of the two. That was the rare joke that had me really chuckling as I read it. So I don't want to lose sight of that, even though that doesn't quite answer your question.
I think that actually highlights something really, really important, which is that Nynaeve is such a great character after book like 2.5. Like she really grows on me and everyone else. And jokes like that are exactly why. I have to give Robert Jordan some flowers. I think that I have on this podcast made it clear that I'm not a huge fan of Robert Jordan, the romance writer. And I think now that I have kind of said that publicly, and so I have been thinking about it as I am reading kind of romantic scenes in this book series, I'm actually slightly revising my opinion. I think Robert Jordan actually writes really good characters thinking about being in love. I just don't think he gives his characters good enough motivation to be in love.
And maybe that's just because like I'm old and they're young and that's how young love works. But I feel like I'm supposed to buy into the fact that Elayne is truly deeply head over heels in love with a man who she met for 2 hours and then didn't see for a year, and then has now had a couple of quiet conversations in the Stone of Tear with. And I think I'm surprised I have that feeling because of anyone I know, you and I should be the ones who believe in relatively young love.
That's very funny. So for listeners who don't know, Tyler and I both I actually don't know. Is Steph your first girlfriend or
No, I had dated
okay.
others before. We were 21 when we got together.
Lame. And so my wife is actually my first girlfriend, and we got together when just before I turned 18. And so I actually was just having a conversation with a family member about a 19-year-old in our family, and she just had a bad breakup. I'm like, that's what being about the 19's all about. You fall hard and you fall out of love. And then I was like, or so I'm told.
Yeah.
I guess I don't get to say that. So I appreciate your joke because I just made it myself. But it is funny because I also had trouble with it. And I tried to read it as like an 18-year-old does that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, again, we have these figures where you're like, you develop a crush in middle school and you're like, this is it. This is like everything. This is my whole life plan. And almost never does that work out. So I tried to read it that way, but I think because every character is taking the prophecy dimension of it so seriously,
Yeah.
it's like we're not even questioning that this is going to happen anymore. I
Yeah.
mean, the end of the chapter, not to jump ahead, they're like, well, what should we do? How do you tell, how do you tell them? But that first part of the conversation, everybody is like, yeah, it's just how it is, and we're
Yeah.
gonna be there. And Egwene seems to have accepted it. To your point, she might not be fully admitting the true nature of her feelings, but seems to have accepted it's Elayne. He's Elayne's. So
Well, and I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at is I'm
yeah.
really frustrated by the motivation for this conversation, but the conversation itself is really well written. I think all of the characters are believable if you just accept the premise that for some reason the most beautiful princess in the world is in love with a random farm boy who she met for 2 hours. It's a great scene. I think it works really
Yeah.
well. It's well written, it's well done. All of the characters are believable and have their own kind of perspective that fits but not perfectly. Like it's a great sequence that I just question the baseline reason for it. And that makes me mad because I want to love it and really like the romantic side of this book. And I think I like it like 80%. I just wish it was better justified.
Uh, yeah, and it's part of it for me is it's like, well, it's a chosen one narrative, right?
Yeah.
So, she is in love with the farm boy, but she is in love with the chosen one. So, again, when are we listening to this? I don't know, but I have already revealed that I'm concurrently reading the Lord of the Rings movies, and as of just before our recording tonight, I moved into the appendices. So take that. And what I was laughing about in relation to this question is the character of Eowyn, who is a slightly different in the books than in the films, but you get this in the films. It's like she's head over heels for Aragorn and ready to be queen. And then I think the movies actually don't really play up the fact that Faramir's again like, hey, I'm here too. And she's like, oh, okay, I'll go with him. Like, and poor Faramir's like, nobody really loves him. He's not the son his dad wanted, and so on. So, but it felt very much like that relationship. It's like Eowyn thought she wanted the chosen one and then was like, I guess the chosen one thing doesn't matter. Also, he loves Liv Tyler, so I'll let it be. But it feels here like Elayne, well, and then not in the Lord of the Rings comparison, Elayne also has a sense of duty, right? And we got a sense of this in the last book that while she's very concerned with all this, she knows she's going to be Queen of Andor and wants to fulfill that well. So is it all that different than showing up naked in Rand's room in the middle of the night? Like there is I'm gonna change from dynamic to valence, right? Because I sound so much smarter that way. But I like valence because to me, valence is like electrons moving in around a nucleus, right? And there are all these different ways in which the same thing is present, but we're seeing these different rotations of it. And so with that valence, it's like, well, it's a political move to align your kingdom with the chosen one. Also, he's a good-looking half Aiel boy from where he's from.
Yep.
And so I think to me that excuses the can you really have fallen in love with him? You barely talked to him.
Yeah, I buy that. And I think to some degree, you've just got to accept like this is a book series where someone in the previous book got bale fired out of existence. Like falling in love in a week isn't really that unbelievable, everything else aside. I then found in once we move past the Rand Elayne Egwene thing, the next moment that really stood out to me was Moiraine saying she knows the face of her husband and only being willing to give the hint that it is not Lan, seemingly for Nynaeve's benefit. What did you make of that? Because it is just out of nowhere, but really intriguing, I think.
That was the moment where I was like, what the heck am I reading? And again, with the other dynamic of the Suan Moraine relationship in my mind.
Yep.
And I think I had just fully cast Moraine as a like monastic person. She's married to the order, right? Not interested with a person in that way.
So, as a first time reader, I'm really curious then. What do you make of this, right? Do you have a prediction? Do you know who it is? Do you have a thought about how Moiraine knows? Like, I just want your baseless speculation, since I think there's nothing here to latch on to other than just the sentence.
Answering your question with the question, is this the part that you think might just be a lie? Because that's where my mind went first. I immediately went to, I don't think this is true, or it's a metaphor. And so, like I just said, if she's married to the order, my husband is Tarvalon, or I mean, it'd be weird to. Well, no, it is a large tower. But sorry, go ahead.
She is bound by the oaths, good sir. I'm pretty sure she could have said, I know my husband. But if she says, I know the face of my husband, her husband has a face. Or she can lie. I'm not taking that completely off the table. We do know that she and Varen contradicted one another a book and a half ago. But assuming that she is bound by the three oaths, I think we're pretty much in literal territory.
Although that could also be I remember the girl I left behind when I went off to war, right? Could it be I know the face of my husband as in the man I would have made my husband if I wasn't devoted to this cause?
Or the man who was my husband.
Yeah, good point. So I'm kind of just I think I'm all of those responses mean I'm looking for ways in which this is not true because it doesn't really make sense to me if she knows she's going to fall in love with a man and that's the end of her story. Like if all of this is previewing a story to come, I have a hard time with that. If it's something that's already kind of resolved itself, I'm much more okay with that.
I'm not going to tell you which it is, but you're going to have to learn to get cool with a lot of things really fast. The next moment that really stood out to me, I thought that the description of what Moiraine wants Rand to do was mostly interesting because she made Elayne give the why of it. And I thought that was a really dynamic move, right? Moiraine is like, this is what I want him to do. Elayne, you know why it's a good idea. Tell them why. And then Elayne has to kind of explain the like cold political dynamics of what is the benefit of it. War is going to come anyways. Here's why you need to do this fast rather than slow. Like, I thought that was a really kind of interesting, effective moment, both to kind of show you how Moiraine is trying to like bring out certain characteristics in these girls and get them thinking in particular ways. But then also, like, she knows that Nynaeve does not trust her, and I think she knows that she'll take it a lot better if Elayne is the one explaining why things need to be this way. Did you pick up on that detail that it's not actually Moiraine who is doing the description? And if so, kind of what did you make of it?
I'm going to tie that to the other dynamic we see. So to me, that read as behind the scenes, I need to fidget and twist until Rand comes to that decision himself. Whereas a little later in the chapter, when they're talking about the options of the three girls where they're going to go, it is very much, here is my advice, make up your own mind. And I think there's a real difference between those two dynamics, right? That I want him to think he's making up his own mind but doing what I want, whereas I will tell you what I want, but it is honestly your choice to go. And that naturally makes me think that she doesn't trust Rand fully, or she thinks less of him than she is starting to think of the three women, which is different.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about that is if Moiraine was just looking at what is getting results, I think that she's getting much better results from the way that she's treating the girls, right? And so my immediate reaction, maybe this is just because I'm an educator, is I'm like, well, maybe go do the nice thing to Rand too. But she, for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be her approach. I think you're exactly right to highlight that she is handling the girls very differently from Rand. And if this is a chapter that like 3 or 4 times in this chapter, Moiraine is like looking the girls up and down, deciding if she trusts them, I think this is pretty good evidence that she trusts them more than she trusts Rand. That's a really good call.
Well, it's what I do. I just come here and make good calls and leave after.
So if that then is what we get out of our description, I think the follow-up then is Moiraine gives a really interesting prophecy / interpretation of prophecy. We got to read this one word for word. I'm very sorry. Power of the shadow made human flesh, wakened to turmoil, strife, and ruin. The reborn one, marked and bleeding, dances the sword in dreams and mist. Chains the shadow sworn to his will from the city lost and forsaken. Leads the spears to war once more, breaks the spears and make them see truth long hidden in the ancient dream. She then states that prophecy could be fulfilled by Rand leading the Spears of Tyr against Samael, who is holding Ilion, which clearly is a lost and forsaken city because one of the Forsaken holds it. I hear that and immediately go, well, that can't be it. Moiraine said it way too confidently with no justification. What was your thought on this excerpt of prophecy?
I feel like I'm being evasive to you over and over again tonight, but I do just want to note that I read that moment really in the context of the fact she revealed just before that, which is that Rand is reading prophecies.
Yeah.
Because to me, that is like big klaxon blaring of like, this is a problem whenever a mythological character reads a prophecy and tries to avoid or make it come to pass, then they actually usually do, but in not the way they expect, because we don't get to control such things. I mean, it's Oedipus, most obviously, right?
Yep.
Like, we will not let this happen. So, oops, we did the things that made it happen. So I thought, first of all, that was a really interesting detail, that Rand is gathering up and pretending he can read languages he doesn't to go through all those things. I then also feel like we are meant to read this, as you just suggested, as the limits of Moraine's skills. She can play everybody and move every piece around her chessboard, but there is an edge to her chessboard, and I think the prophecy starts to move out beyond it, and she can't even see how these things are actually going to happen. And we know this from when she went to the cabin in the woods and read a bunch of them, right? That she had to keep studying and is trying to figure them out in advance of Rand, but I don't think we can guarantee that she will.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this is if we think of Moiraine, I think you said earlier, you described it really well. She is just, all she does is work. She does her job. She has a goal. Everything in her life is designed to achieve that goal. And I think that we're kind of seeing here, whenever someone has like, something they're really great at, it often comes with like kind of some negative, right? If you are really good at just putting your nose to the grindstone, you might be the kind of person who's bad at putting work away, right? And I think that what we're seeing here is Moiraine is so good at making connections and playing the politics and figuring things out that when she thinks she has the right answer, she never considers that it could be wrong. And I think that's what we're running into here. She says, here's my interpretation. It fits. It must be correct. And I think that we're kind of both now saying that might not be the only way this prophecy could come true. And the second you start trying to manipulate prophecy to what you think it means instead of what it actually means, the odds of you kind of getting something wrong are almost 100%.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that only with it then makes me nervous whenever, because Moiraine is always seems to be the most in control. So whenever we go beyond what she controls, that starts to make me nervous. And to use that as a transition into we then get the kind of dump about we had a big cache of Ter Angrial, and there's one in particular that she wants Rand to use.
She wants to use it herself.
Oh, okay. So she wants to use that. And I do like, in case you were afraid this was a Deus Ex Machina, Nynaeve is like, oh, great, we can use it for all our problems too. And she's immediately like, no, we can use it like one time, and if we make a mistake or ask a stupid question, you die. So it's clearly going to be something of great import. I guessed this is to your joke in your summary. I guess this is what the chapter is named after.
Probably
is this doorway, but it seems to only be one. But it was it feels like I'm gonna go to video games since you did before. This is like your tutorial task. It's like we got to do this before we actually get to go do the adventure you want to do, because it doesn't sound like it's a big and important thing, but it's like something you have to handle to learn how to move and jump before you get to go fight people in the story.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think you hear it described and it feels like, as you said, it's either way too powerful. It either solves any question that you need addressed, or it feels, as you say, kind of like minor and just a stop along the road. And so it's this odd place that I think a description like this does. It creates kind of an anticipation for something, but it almost feels inevitable that it won't be that important if it's getting brought up this early and this directly and explained this clearly, right? I don't know why. For some reason, I just don't trust anything that happens in the first like fifth of a book. I'm like, it's got to be a red herring in some way. Why else would they have it there? I don't know. Do you expect this to be something that pays off now or something that pays off a long time from now?
I was gonna say you're doing the classic Dr. House. It's not lupus, right?
Yeah.
Where it's never that first answer. I think that in classic mythological terms, it's going to give her the answers, but with bigger questions, right? Like it's simply not going to. I think this is a piece of plot that gets resolved quickly, but does not offer any sense of resolution. That it really just, and I think that is also important why you can only do it once, because she's going to do it once and not be able to be like, question 1B or what have you as a follow-up. So I feel like we will go to this place also because we're here and it seems like we're about to go other places. And I did catch the detail. All of them, including this doorway, are being sent to Tar Valon, right? So there are boats coming to take everything and they control these. And I continue to have trouble with the levels of Angrial, but it does seem like as this book is being laid out, especially where we have the Amico Tanchico and this, it's like, okay, the Ter Angrial seem to be really key to where we're going in this book. The sword does not count as one of those.
So the sword is a sa'angreal. So it is. So Angriel and sa'angreal are basically degrees of the same thing. They just mean you can channel more of the power than you ordinarily could. Ter Angrial is basically any other magic item.
Okay. And so we are headed to collect something else probably. And, I'm curious to see the mythology around these grow, because they did feel like a later addition. Like it wasn't obvious in the first book as much, and now they grow in importance. And it seems like we keep getting references to the fact that we don't really know how they were made or what blah blah blah. It's like, well,
Yeah.
I imagine we will learn some of that at some point in this series. So I'm curious for all of that. And you know, I like Moiraine having something to do. I think when she's listless or disappears, I like these books less because she is one of the characters I enjoy. So giving her kind of a juicy piece, even if it's early on in the book and then she fades, that got me excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only other real kind of note that I had, because a lot of the end of this chapter is kind of re-resolution of the girls talking about Rand and kind of figuring out what they're going to do with that. There is one moment there that really stood out to me, though, which is Moiraine kind of leaves the conversation like, I hope you all know you can't really do anything with Rand. He belongs to the pattern now. And the girl's immediate response to that is like, what a silly woman who knows more than us. And that both feels exactly accurate. And like, I don't know, this entire chapter, I guess I found myself, as you said, doing the like, it can't be lupus because it's what they're mentioning in Act One. But this was the one time where I was like, girls, maybe listen to the lady who knows some things.
you you just don't understand him like I do. I can change him, right? I can turn him into the man I want. It does feel hopeless, right? And
Yeah.
you know, I'm imagining that Rand is not going to survive the conflict ahead. Like I don't think this is the type of chosen one that gets a happily ever after from the feeling of things.
Yeah, blood on the rocks is pretty clear.
Yeah, yeah. So I just can't get invested really. I mean, I can sympathize with Elayne and want her to succeed for her own heart, but I just can't think that that's going to be how this wraps up. This doesn't feel like a YA where the couple ends up together and they get to be together and in love.
Well, if for no reason other than according to Min, it's going to be a quadruple, not a
Oh,
couple.
right.
Any last thoughts on this chapter? I think we've had a lot of kind of things to dive in and talk about, but mostly it was big picture stuff. I didn't have a lot of tiny details. Was there any like little things that stood out to you or you wanted to highlight before we wrap up the episode?
No, again, I think my key takeaway would just be it was fun to get these characters back in the mix. They still feel isolated, and I would like to see them interact with the silly boys a little bit more. And, you know, some of these characters have not actually gotten to talk to each other in a long time, right? Like this group interacted with Matt, yes, Matt, and but they haven't really talked to Perrin in a long time, and especially to Rand. Rand hasn't really talked to anybody, quote unquote, on screen. He's had some conversations seemingly in the gaps. So, you know, I recently was listening to some writers on The Office talk about how eventually they just pull down a couple cards and be like, sure, Stanley and Oscar, let's see what happens. And it's like I feel like we need to do that here and just grab a couple of these people in the mix and throw them in and see you know, what happens when you put those two elements together. So that's what I'm looking forward to when we continue on into 2 chapters again next week, which would be chapter 7, Playing with Fire, and chapter 8, Hard Heads. And I stole that so that you have to close out the episode.
We're learning how to play the game now. This is going to be competitive. Who has to end the podcast? I like it. We are going to get exactly what you described next week. We've got kind of 2, you know, sets of characters who haven't had a chance to interact yet. And so it's time to put them all together and shake up the hat and see what happens when you draw a couple of names out of those slips. So we've got some good stuff coming up. And let me tell you, my countdowns are now getting really short until all of the things that I have been excited for you all to experience since the beginning of this series. It's happening.
And the title. We're so close to the title at this point. That's what I'm counting down towards. So,
very soon,
go ahead.
You will know what it means when I say this podcast next week will go through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.